What's up, ladies and gents, Ghost here. So today I've got the second episode of Ghost Stories. Last week, or it wasn't last week, but last episode, we were talking about the differences between the English and the Icelandic language. I was also going over some English sayings and really expressing how having learnt a second language fluently has really increased my perspective on where a lot of things in the English language come from. Anyway, this was like a pilot episode, so you guys seemed to enjoy it even though it wasn't gaming related. Now, speaking of the gaming part, the background footage today is from Battlefield 3. We're playing on Death Valley, or I'm playing on Death Valley rather, and this is from the Armored Kill DLC, so it's an awesome map. I went back to Battlefield 3 the other day and had a blast playing this. However, as you well know, that is not what we are going to be talking about today. Today, I would like to go over cultural differences between different countries. So, having moved to Iceland, I've really noticed a lot of these. Now, you might think that, Iceland and England, they're pretty close together. You may think that things aren't really all too different. And if you had come here, you probably wouldn't think that still, you'd think weather's pretty similar, people are pretty similar. If you talk English to Icelanders, they sort of adapt to your culture, and they act like an American, I would say, when they speak English. But if you're actually integrated into society like I am, and you've learnt a language, you actually start to notice a lot of differences between the Icelandic people and English people. So being raised in England, many of you will be familiar that in England, and also a lot of countries around the world, a lot of people have good manners there, okay? So if you bump into anybody in a shopping mall or in the supermarket or whatever, you'll usually say sorry. You'll be like, oh, sorry, I bumped into you, I accidentally sort of touched you, I was in the way of you. Really, it takes almost anything for an English person to be like, sorry, sorry, sorry. They're saying sorry all day long for absolutely everything. If somebody doesn't hold the door for you, they will say sorry. And that's just the culture, that's just the way it is there. People, generally speaking, are well-mannered. There's always, a few chav dickheads in every neighbourhood, I'm sure. But the majority of the people are pretty well-mannered. So when I came to Iceland and learnt Icelandic, I got a bit of a culture shock there because people in Iceland aren't really like that. Take like door opening for one thing. I've actually realised that this is a skill to be mastered, alright? So I work in a hotel, there are a lot of doors there, there's an elevator, there's, often many people coming in that elevator, so sort of holding doors for people and being a little bit considerate is rather important. I have kind of learned that Icelanders don't know how to open doors, and you may say that sounds pretty stupid because it's not like it's a fine science, but I've actually discovered that, people have instincts when it comes to opening doors built deep into their brain. There's that kind of white line where if you're going through a door and you know there's somebody like coming behind you, you have to think, is that person too far away from me? So should I just close the door and let them open it again? Or is that person close enough that if I don't open the door and hold it for them, they will be somewhat offended and think, wow, what's that guy's problem? Because a lot of the time in Iceland, I will just have doors slammed in my face. Not really in the figurative way, not being able to get a job kind of way, but in a literal way. But you know what the worst kind of people here are? The passive-aggressive door openers. You know the ones I mean, the ones where you're like 200 meters down a corridor and then somebody decides that they're going to hold the door for you. Instead of just letting the door go and waiting until you reach the door so you can open it, they'll just like hold it for you and stare at you and create this weird awkward situation where you have to all of a sudden start jogging down the corridor because you feel like it's now your duty to get to that person as quickly as possible because they're sort of waiting around for you and trying to do you a favour. Don't you hate that? Like, that's so annoying, man. It makes you feel like a right tit. Another weird thing here is sort of situational awareness. And when I say that, I don't mean like Battlefield situational kind of awareness, where enemies are coming from and stuff. I mean just being aware of like who's around you. Is there somebody standing behind you, to the side of you? I work in like a busy kitchen, so there's often lots of people standing around, walking around, and we've got our situational awareness pretty much down. We always know to a T when there's someone to the left of us, to the right of us, behind us, wherever, and if we're coming through with some sort of hot liquid or whatever it may be. But as for the general populace in Iceland, whenever you go to like a supermarket, you will always get someone who just blocks the entire aisle with the supermarket trolley. And you're just kind of standing there like, excuse me? I'm kind of trying to get past you, dude. And they'll be like, oh, Well, fine then. That's kind of the attitude they have a lot of the time, especially like the older generation. The younger generation, not so bad. They're kind of adapting to modern day times, but the older generation, really, really bad. Now, I know it sounds like I'm painting Iceland in a bad light, but this is really just down to culture. I'm not saying that Icelanders are dicks or obnoxious people or bad-mannered, but it's sort of, for a foreigner, you often feel that way. And I've talked to many other foreigners as well from different countries about these topics, and I just, I kind of feel like Icelanders are so rude, man. And they're like, yeah, I know, it's crazy. But I think it really comes down to what's happened in the past. I mean, if you take Iceland as a country, okay, Iceland is essentially a huge volcanic rock. It was made from a below-sea volcano that erupted and created this island that we now all know as Iceland. It's a very young landmass compared to the majority of the rest of the world. So first of all, the culture here hasn't really had the same amount of time to flourish, although Iceland is actually pretty technologically advanced. I think a lot of people come here expecting there to be very crappy internet, not really the same technology as in other places of the world, and they will actually be pretty surprised. It's actually one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, I believe, so that's quite interesting. But really, when it comes to the people here, it was Norwegians who first colonized Iceland, and they first came over to Iceland, and really the Icelanders were pretty much left to themselves. I mean, yes, they were sort of governed then by Norway, and of course much later on in more recent times by Denmark, but really Iceland has always just been left to itself. They've never been involved in any wars really, except for having the Americans come and stay here during the Second World War. And when Iceland was colonized, it was during very tumultuous times. It was, I think, 876, I think that was the year that Iceland was actually culturalized. So, that's the first people actually came over to Iceland. That's only what, like 1250 years ago? Something like that. That's really not that long for, a people to really develop their cultures and all that kind of thing. And when people came over here, of course, everybody was Vikings. They actually set up a parliament after 100 years or so. They had rules in this parliament, like, if you would kill, for example, my sister, I would essentially be able to kill one member of your family and get off scot-free, because it was like, an eye for an eye, essentially. You owed me that death. And those are the rules, they're pretty bad rules if you look at it from today's point of view, but there were some rules. So this mentality of every man for himself, keep to yourself, started to breed then, I think, at least. Now, if we look at other countries and going to war, especially, England, of course, is a prime example throughout the ages, has been involved in so many wars. Of course, the most recent war was the Second World War. And, my dad, he was born in 1950, and I remember him telling me stories about when he was younger, because, obviously that was just a few years after the war ended, how friendly people in England were to one another, and how much anybody that you met on the street, even though it was a complete stranger, they would do anything for you. Because wars do that. In times of dire need, it brings people together, it makes them stick together, band together, and really sort of buffs up their teamwork a lot. And he would always complain like, oh, I remember how it was after the war, it was great, people would do anything together, you could leave your bike unchained, you could leave your house unlocked, nobody would steal from you, because it was like the whole nation was together as a whole, and now it's all gone to shit, and you can't do anything anymore. But this is one experience that Iceland has also never had. They've never been involved in a war. They've pretty much done a good job of staying out of the world's business, which is actually one of the reasons I really like living here. You don't have to deal with all of that kind of stuff. But once again, it's bred this mentality of, just keep to yourself. If you go up to a stranger in Iceland on the street and just randomly start talking to them, if you do it in English, it's okay. They'll probably think, oh, he's a foreigner, they'll understand. But if you're an Icelander, they don't really do that to each other. They won't chit-chat to each other, More likely than not, you would just get somebody looking at you and thinking that you were a bit of a weirdo, quite frankly. And this difference was never more apparent to me than when I went to Canada. Okay, so when I went over to Canada, we did quite a lot of clothes shopping, because things in Canada there, for shopping for us is much, much cheaper. Essentially everything is around half price. So I bought a lot of electronics, we went and bought a lot of clothes. I went with my girlfriend and also one of her friends. And it was fantastic shopping experience, because even if we were just going in a shop to buy very casual clothing, all the people there were super helpful. You know, we went to a sports shop. This guy was like, "Oh, where are you guys from?" We explained that we're from Iceland, but, you know, I was English, and he was like, "Oh, yeah, I can totally hear it in your accent, man." And, you know, he just had a bit of a chat to us, chit-chatted, as if we were just two people meeting on the street, even though we happened to work in the shop as well. Whenever I went in other clothes shops, the person would always instantly come over and be like, "Can I help you with something?" And they would introduce themselves by name, be like, you know, "My name's Judy," or whatever, and, you know, "Here are the changing rooms, and just let me know if you need any assistance." And, you know, customer service, that's generally what people are trained in. And yeah, half of that is just the fact that it's required of them for their jobs. You know, they're told you have to be polite, you have to be happy, you have to be smiley. But I feel that there's also a certain amount of just personal human coming through there. You know, that person just chooses to do their job in that way. Now, when I came back to Iceland, I got the biggest culture shock ever, because there really isn't anything in Iceland called customer service. You don't, if you want to work in a supermarket, you don't have to be bubbly and smiley to anybody. People will just, you know, look like, "Oh my god, I hate my job, this is the worst thing ever, how can I get out of this?" And it's a very bizarre thing to me. I don't know, you know, customer service is almost non-existent. I mean, I remember when I was going to buy a suit one time, and even then, I was going to spend like $500 on a suit, you know. Nobody came over to help me. Nobody wanted to help me. In fact, the only interaction I had with the people working there is one of the girls came over and was like, "Yeah, we're closing in like 15 minutes, so can you, you know, kind of think about leaving?" And I would be like, "That's weird you're saying that. I'm like gonna spend $500 in your store." You know what I mean? That would never happen in other countries. It's very bizarre. But that said, I do love living in Iceland, and once you get used to the Icelandic people, they are very nice. There is actually no word in the Icelandic language really for please, so there's no way to emphasize a request to somebody, or if you're asking somebody something, you can't put that extra little embellishment on there of please to make it sound a little bit nicer. You just can't do it. Icelanders don't do it, so as a result, when they speak English, they very seldom use the word please there as well. But I suppose it's like my old Icelandic teacher said to me, Icelanders have nice words, but they save them for when they actually need them. So there you go, guys. Let me know down below in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I know it's been a little bit of an odd commentary for those of you who were perhaps expecting something gaming related, and it's been a bit of a longer one than usual, but sometimes I do enjoy, you know, just doing a completely unscripted, loose commentary where I can sort of babble on a bit and really get some of my thoughts out there. Hopefully share a little bit of life experience with some of you guys. Yeah, just let me know what you think, guys. I would really, really be thrilled if you would do that. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.